who don't know what the IISCA is, can you tell us what does the IISCA stand for and what is the general assessment model?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, so the abbreviation is probably the easiest way to say it, and hopefully it picks up. But it's interview-informed synthesized contingency analysis. And the reason why it is such a big name is because it has some integral components that we wanted to identify in the title. So first, the analysis is informed by an open-ended interview. The process is inductive in the sense that we never know what the analysis will look like beforehand. The procedures of the test and control conditions are individualized for each patient. So it requires that qualitatively rich information provided by caregivers in addition to an observation period. So the observation period then takes that information from the interview and unsystematically tests out the hypotheses or the hypothesized contingencies from the interview. And we just sort of use that time to refine our definitions of what the problem behavior is and what the contingency will look like. We only include one test condition per control. So this is to ensure that the control condition is intimately matched to the test and that all procedures and materials are identical with the exception of the change in the contingency. And then this last component, which people seem to be, let's just say, concerned about, is that we synthesize the contingencies when implicated to co-occur during the interview and observation. We'll discuss this more, I'm sure, later, but I just want to mention that they don't necessarily always have to be synthesized. It's just when it is implicated. So sometimes the analysis can be an interview-informed isolated contingency analysis or an IICA, if you will, if that ever picks up. But the important thing to know is that, or to do, is to match the patient's ecology to treat the problematic context as a whole rather than sort of unnaturally isolate variables in the environment.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that idea, it's not that all contingencies or all variables that maintain problem behavior need to be synthesized, just that they do occur. But we'll get more into, I guess, the nuances of the IISCA. But I just want to clarify one of the points you just made. You said that it's a matched control. What does a matched control mean?
So matched control just means that all the variables that you include in the test condition are the only variables that you include in the control as well. The only thing that's going to change is whether or not those variables are presented contingent or non-contingently on behavior. So basically, if we were to say that attention, just as an example, even though it's not synthesized, we'll say that attention is the reinforcer. In your test condition, you provide it contingently on the problem behavior, and in your control, you provide it non-contingently without any toys, without any other sort of elements in there.
So if one were to test, let's say, if attention was a reinforcer for problem behavior, and then they compared that to a control condition, which was a toy play condition, that would be not a matched control. Is that right?
That is correct. The thing about the toy play control is that you're including that the toys themselves, which are not related to the behavior at all. So it's a confound in that you're adding items that are not representative of the test condition.
Is it also possible that the reinforcers not related to problem behavior that are added to the control condition, so let's say toys, could compete with the reinforcers for problem behavior, and that's why you see response suppression?
Yeah, and I like how you brought that up, that you call it suppression, because technically it could be that you are suppressing behavior rather than eliminating it based on the same reinforcement that is used in the test condition.
Is the IISCA a functional analysis? Would it be fair to call it a functional analysis?
Yeah, I really think it depends on how you define a functional analysis. But if we say that a functional analysis is a process consisting of the direct observation of problem behavior and the manipulation of environmental events in order to understand the behavior before it is treated, then yes, we fit that definition wholly, and any sort of FA format really does fit that definition. And there's different functional analysis formats out there. Maybe we'll talk about them later or not, but there really is no rule that we need to use a specific one, right? There's no rule out there stating that we need to use the standard or a brief format. We just choose to use a different format because we found it to be more efficient, more controlled, effective, and practical. So, and most of that statement that I just made comes from our research, but I'll admit freely that some of my conclusions come from just the success of the model in practice as well. So the idea is when you start with the problematic context as a whole, rather than breaking it up into individual parts, you create a treatment intended to serve the same situation that caregivers originally identified and they came to you for help.
Interview-informed analysis, is that right?
Yes.
So it seems like the interview is important.
Yes.
But I guess my first question is, for people who do functional analyses, it typically does begin with some information gathering process. And part of that information gathering process is speaking to caregivers or speaking to teachers or speaking to individuals who are familiar with the child. So then I guess my question is, if that is the case, and that is a typical course of how an FA is conducted, then aren't all FAs interview-informed, and calling it an interview-informed analysis a bit redundant?
I really do hope that most analyses, at least people conducting them, start with an interview. The literature seems to suggest otherwise because it's not very often that an interview is mentioned, but it could just be that they're not, or they're overlooking that detail. And that interviews are always conducted. So let's just assume that everyone does it. But for one, the one thing, or there are multiple things that separate us out, but the interviews are not always useful in informing an analysis other than to get an idea of the topographies of problem behavior that will be measured. So sometimes you interview a family member, but you just ask them questions about what the problem behavior is going to look like. And closed-ended assessments usually end up pigeonholing caregivers into answering in ways they may not fully agree with. So what you typically end up with is the same analysis for every patient, right? Attention, escape, alone, and then sometimes a tangible test condition. Furthermore, an interview is conducted to determine things like the appropriate age level of academic tasks to use. But it doesn't specify the actual tasks that could be evoking problem behavior or the things that could be related to the problem behavior themselves. So if we just take an example of a mother who answers yes when you ask a closed-ended question like, does your child engage in problem behavior to avoid tasks? She can't follow up or open up about how it only occurs during cleaning tasks or when I tell them to play with others. So I think it'd be much quicker if we can open it up to open-ended assessment and ask them questions to really give us a richer detail of where that problem behavior is occurring, what's occurring after it, and how we can include all that information in the analysis rather than sort of piece together or fill in the little gaps that are left when we have our conditions already created.
How can we be sure that the information we're getting from the interview, whether it's open-ended or closed-ended or whatever the process might be, that what the caregiver is giving us is actually accurate? Because I'm sure, as you know, the literature on indirect and direct assessments or descriptive assessments often show that caregivers are not always great at reporting or really identifying the variables that maintain problem behavior. So a caregiver might report that their child seems to engage in problem behavior to get their attention, but when we conduct a more formal analysis, we actually find that the problem behavior might be maintained by access to tangible items. Mm-hmm. So given that is the case, or it seems to be the case, what can we really say about the validity of the interview and whether the information we're getting from caregivers could really be useful to inform the analysis?
Yeah, and those questions we use in our open-ended interview they're never asking them to analyze the behavior themselves. We ask them to describe the situation, and then we do the analysis ourselves based on the reports. But you are right when you say that interviews themselves and observations themselves are not reliable when used alone. So the idea is our interview could also be unreliable by itself, but what we do is we validate it each time we conduct the functional analysis. So someone could do the research if they wanted to. I'm personally not too interested in validating just the interview, it's more interesting to me to validate the entire process, which is what we did. So we validate the treatment effects following the IISCA and find it to be have high treatment validity. But what someone could do is call together a bunch of IISCAs and the number of attempts required to find out how many interviews it took, or how many times we had to conduct the analysis following an interview to get it right, and that would tell you how valid it is.
So let's say that typically through your process, that caregivers are pretty good at reporting perhaps the situations in which problem behavior occurs. And from that, you're able to design an analysis. And let's also say that the IISCA is a fairly efficient method of conducting an FA. If the parents are accurate or they're good at describing the conditions, and the goal is just efficiency, getting through the assessment and getting to treatment as fast as possible because the kids that see us are there for treatment, then why do an FA at all? Why not just go straight to a treatment based on what the caregivers have reported?
Yeah, that's really the thing, is that first we need to make sure that they are accurately reporting. And to be honest, parents are really good. I mean, they've lived with these kids, right? 24 hours a day. Most of the time they have to wake up in the middle of the night, but they're really good at describing what's problematic for them. Now we then, as the behavior analysts, figure out what the reinforcers are ourselves, and that's where the analysis comes in. So our logic doesn't change just because you are using a different functional analysis format. Although the interview may help us discover specific reinforcement contingencies that may be influencing problem behavior, the analysis is needed to demonstrate the sensitivity of problem behavior to those factors. And there really is this sort of professional humility that is evident when we as behavior analysts kind of hold off on claims of controlling variables until we've seen those variables actually control behavior. And by conducting that analysis, we're holding ourselves to that reasonable and scientific standard of proof rather than just listening to reports.
If one were to just combine all potential reinforcers together in a synthesized contingency and then implement a treatment based off of those and kind of a reversal, so you got an AB, where you're based on your synthesized contingencies, a B phase of treatment, and then reversed and replicated that. How do you know which of those contingencies is maintaining problem behavior? I'm sure you know very well that when you aggregate responses into a class and then you expose them to aggregated contingencies, you set up a situation in which problem behavior is almost guaranteed to occur, but you don't know which responses are maintained by which contingencies. And so you're kind of lost in this mystery of if problem behaviors are maintained by single control, one contingency, multiple control, so individual contingencies, or combined control like you would see in a synthesized analysis. So how do you, I guess, get around that, or how do you navigate that problem of not knowing what's maintaining the individual contingencies? Or do you think that with the IISCA, we're actually able to answer that question?
Yeah, I just want to start by, we make this distinction, or I like to make this distinction, at least it's me, between a pragmatic understanding of the maintaining variables and then this atomistic sort of understanding. So based on a pragmatic perspective, a synthesized contingency more readily understands the behavior in the environment in which it occurs. Of course, when we do that, we lose any understanding of the isolated effects of each, but we have the information we need to create an effective treatment. By attempting to isolate reinforcement, the standard functional analysis, it may do a better job at that atomistic understanding of individual variables, but then on that flip side, it doesn't tell you anything about how they will interact when synthesized. So it comes down to what's your experimental question and what are you looking to answer? Isolated versus synthesized, it gives you a different answer. And I do want to point out the difference in what we call isolated versus synthesized is not as dichotomous as we make it seem. Those categories we separated reinforcement into are socially constructed, and have some level of synthesis, whether some people want to admit it or not. So sometimes attention includes physical touch and verbal reprimands. Well, that's a synthesis of positive reinforcement. And sometimes a child escapes from tasks and then they begin to sing to themselves or engage in stereotypy. And for them, there's that dreaded synthesis of positive and negative reinforcement. So, in fact, if you want to go down that atomistic road, right, you can really isolate the effects of any certain types of attention, like praise versus reprimands. Then you can go a step further, find a smaller atom and isolate that by looking at the intonation of praise, positive or negative intonation. So really, every contingency is likely some form of synthesis. And from an applied perspective, we're just stopping at that level that best informs our treatment.
From your perspective, and I guess just correct me if I'm misquoting you here or misinterpreting, from your perspective, you get enough information from the synthesized analysis to develop an effective treatment. And so the individual contingencies are not as important.
For the question we're trying to answer, and that's a strictly applied or pragmatic question we're looking to answer.
How do you respond to people who say that combining all of the contingencies that potentially maintain problem behavior and then exposing it to some treatment that allows the child to get access to all those reinforcers? So let's say functional communication training, where you teach a child an appropriate alternative way of requesting reinforcers. So let's say we have problem behavior maintained by access to tangibles, but then we synthesize an attention contingency into that. Some people might say that that's kind of behavior modification-esque, because we're adding in things that are unrelated to the problem behavior and exposing it to these kinds of treatments that historically we've tried to move away from. So how do you respond to people who say this isn't an analysis as much as it is behavior modification, which is a pretty strong criticism, I'd say, but I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, it is a pretty strong criticism, and to be honest, I find it a little ironic. You look at these large-scale outcome studies that use standard functional analyses, such as Greer et al. Just had one come out in 2016. I even co-authored one with Griffin Rooker in 2013, and then Hagopian kind of started that whole pattern back in 1998. And all these studies have multiple examples of cases requiring the addition of punishment, the addition of arbitrary reinforcement, because they could not get large enough reductions in problem behavior using just function-based treatments. And in the large-scale IISCA study that's in press right now, what we did was we didn't rely on any punishment or arbitrary reinforcement. It's just the reinforcers that we identified as being functionally related that we used. I think people have, and the way we talk about it, right, attention, escape, tangible, I think people have gotten into this idea because we've gotten so used to the categories that we've created, these categories of reinforcement, that they've been confused as what could be the sole indicators of an analysis. So if we provide escape, let's just say as an example, escape from adult-directed play to child-directed play contingent on problem behavior during an FA. Well, based on those categories, that includes some sort of demands, that includes some sort of attention, that includes tangible. Therefore, we've hit every category that we've created of reinforcement. So that means we've included every reinforcer known to man, which means we're BMOD, or behavior modification. I don't like thinking about reinforcement in such a restricted manner, because those categories are defining our perception of what reinforcement is. And it should really be the other way around. So I really think it's sufficient that our analysis and treatment is constructed from a controlling contingency that is ecologically relevant. And really, that is a far cry from what behavior modification is, when it relies on arbitrary reinforcers and punishers.
My last kind of question about synthesis is, there was a paper published recently in 2016 in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis by Fisher and colleagues, who compared the synthesized IISCA model, the outcomes of that, to the outcomes of a standard or more traditional functional analysis, where the individual contingencies are tested one at a time. And they found in their paper that the IISCA often identified contingencies that were relevant to the maintenance of problem behavior that the standard FA did not. And so one of their conclusions was, or one of the things that they might have suggested was, is the IISCA prone to these false positives? That it might actually include things, you might actually end up identifying things that are not related to problem behavior based on the analysis. And so they kind of suggested researchers and practitioners proceed with caution when using this IISCA model. What's your take on those results about the IISCA and potential false positives?
That was a very interesting article, and I definitely have a lot of respect for someone like Wayne Fisher. He's not a fan of my work, and that's evident, but he responds with empiricism and allows for our research discussions to just grow. So, but the article is funny in terms of what we're looking at, because we see the same data, but I come to a completely different conclusion. And just so people know, in that paper, how it starts off is Wayne creates a definition of what a false positive is. And that is, and you can correct me because you probably know this better than I do, but a false positive, by their definition, is if you see the same rate of responding when the reinforcers are isolated, and when you see the same rate as with a synthesized contingency, then that's indicative of false positive. And then he goes on to show that based on this definition, when they saw a differentiation out of 4 to 5, I believe, of the participants, what they saw was that pattern. Same rates in the isolated conditions as in the synthesized conditions, suggesting that the IISCA saw some false positives. But Wayne Fisher himself actually came out with an article in 96 stating that the rate of responding is likely to be a function of the duration of the reinforcer delivery during a functional analysis. So participants should really be responding optimally, least amount of effort with the greatest payout. So for example, if attention is provided for 30 seconds, contingent on problem behavior, that should produce one response every 30 seconds when attention is removed, for an entire rate of 2 responses per minute. And then Roscoe actually had an article in 99 showing that less preferred and more preferred items could maintain the same rates of responding when presented alone. So my thought experiment for this, based on that idea of a false positive, is say you have a button and you could press it in one condition and it produces 30 seconds escape from a TV show you hate, like the last season of Arrested Development. That was terrible. And another condition, the button press produces 30-second access to a more preferred TV show like Seinfeld. We all love Seinfeld.
Yep.
Now in the last condition, it changes the channel. So you go from Arrested Development to Seinfeld for 30 seconds. Across those conditions, you're likely to see the same rate of responding, right? Every 30 seconds, you're just going to press the button to get that reinforcer, whether it be synthesized or not. But changing channels or switching channels seems to be more conducive to our natural environment. So just to me, the definition of a false positive that he created was somewhat flawed, and I think it's overly simplified. An interactive effect need not always be that sort of additive, 1 + 1, then we have 2 for the synthesis. Demonstrating falsity really requires more than a single test of relevance, I think.
I think what is most cool about this area is that we have different labs doing this research and trying to answer these questions. And I think, from a research perspective and from a perspective of helping the field grow and move forward, and even developing the best kinds of treatments for the individuals that we serve, I think it's a really exciting time to be doing this kind of work. And I'm really kind of happy to see stuff like the Fisher et al. Study and stuff that you've been publishing, because although it seems like they might be on different ends of the spectrum, I think those are the types of studies that are really going to help answer questions relevant to this area.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm starting to see independent labs conduct the IISCA research, which is incredible for us, because when we started, right, it's just you out there. And I'm sure Brian Owada felt the same way when in the first 5 years when he ran the standard functional analysis, it was him and his team. And then when you start to see other people actually get excited about what you do and they start to do it, It really gets you motivated